Hey, this is Mark Goldberg with the United Nations Affairs blog UN Dispatch. Very pleased to be speaking with Kristele Younes today from Refugees International. Hey, Kristele.
Hi, Mark.
Good, good. Well, first, thanks so much for speaking to me today. We're going to be talking about a situation that doesn't get covered a lot, which is the sort of Afghan refugee and displaced crisis. Kristele, you're at Refugees International?
Exactly.
And what is your official title?
I'm a senior advocate.
Senior advocate. And maybe by way of introduction, can you explain a bit what Refugee International does?
Of course. Refugees International is an independent humanitarian advocacy organization. Basically what we do is we go to places where there are refugee crises or crises of persons who have been internally displaced in their own country because of armed conflict. We assess the humanitarian situation, look at what's being done, what's not, what are the reasons, also look at potential durable solutions for these populations, and then we advocate with all the stakeholders, local governments, the United Nations, policymakers in Europe, in the US, Congress, State Department, etc., to try to improve the living conditions on the ground for these populations.
And you just returned from Afghanistan and put out a report with one of your colleagues, Patrick Duplass. And maybe can you sort of maybe set the scene for us? What is sort of the situation regarding Afghan refugees? Again, it's not something we hear very much about. How many are there? Where are they? Sort of what kind of challenges do they face?
Of course. In terms of refugees that are remaining outside of the country, we are still looking at very large numbers. There's still about 2.4 million in Pakistan who are registered, so probably more than that. And about 1 million in Iran, and again, probably more than that. Since 2002, more than 5 million Afghans have returned to their country in the largest repatriation operation ever. So all in all, we're talking about almost 10 million individuals who have been displaced or who are still currently displaced and who still have certain degrees of vulnerability.
Is there sort of like a unique set of challenges that returning Afghans face?
Well, they certainly are. A lot of people who returned to Afghanistan were actually away for decades. They left during the Soviet invasion. They sometimes left during the Mujahideen regime in the 90s. So depending on the situation, some of them have been away for a very long time. Some were born overseas and don't know anything about Afghanistan. Many were living in cities in Pakistan and Iran and had to return back to their provinces of origin in Afghanistan in rural environments where they don't own land, they don't have shelters, they don't really have skills or material possessions that would allow them to survive in that environment. Others have joined the ranks of urban poor in Kabul or in other cities and have not really been provided the assistance they needed to really be fully reintegrated.
And sort of you said most refugees are in either Pakistan or Iran. How would your situation differ if you're a Afghan refugee in Pakistan versus an Afghan refugee in Iran?
It's difficult for me to comment on the situation in Iran because I haven't been there for years, but we were recently in Pakistan on the same mission when we went to Afghanistan, and Pakistan is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention. They have been gracious hosts to Afghans for over 30 years, but they are reaching the end of their rope. They want all Afghans to return home. What they are doing currently is not renewing papers for Afghans and hoping that by the end of 2009, 2.4 million Afghans will have returned to their country. To push them to return, the Pakistani government went insofar as destroying some refugee camps, bulldozing the houses and really pushing people out of them. This is, of course, a very big problem. We believe that people who are remaining in Pakistan often have very good reasons not to go back to their country, to Afghanistan. They need continued protection, they need continued assistance, and we need to see the international community step in and support the Pakistani government to find durable solutions for these people. Iran is a signatory to the 1951 Refugee Convention, but has become much more intolerant to refugees recently. Iran has declared in its own country 19 no-go areas for foreigners, and refugees who are being found in those no-go areas are often deported. Similarly, a lot of people who go to Iran for economic reasons to find work because the situation in Afghanistan is so dire are subjected to deportations in conditions that are sometimes extremely difficult.
And so you mentioned that sort of Pakistan is not a signatory to the Refugee Convention. Iran is. What sort of rights are afforded to refugees under the convention?
Well, there's a variety of rights, depending, of course, on whether the country that signed and ratified the convention made any reservations to these rights. But these rights include the right to safe asylum as long as they cannot return in safety and dignity and voluntarily to their country of origin. They include the right to education, the right to work, the right to, freedom of movement, etc. So a variety of civil, political, and economic rights that we take for granted, but of course are extremely important to refugees.
So in Iran right now, in Afghanistan right now, what is sort of being done to mitigate the crisis? I mean, you have a really large NATO operation, you have a really large, or a somewhat large UN operation. What, for example, is the UN operation they're doing to sort of address this issue of returning Afghan refugees, but also Afghanistan's internally displaced?
Well, the UN assistance missions to Afghanistan, UNAMA, is a mission that is mostly political in nature. It is there to assist the government of Afghanistan, to assist in building institutions, to assist in its mandate, etc. Humanitarian issues have largely been neglected by the international community in Afghanistan. This is hopefully being rectified. UNAMA is making a strong effort in the past few months to bring humanitarian issues back on the table, to put them on the forefront of priorities, and to give the resources that are needed to its officers to really address the issues. In the meantime, the UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, has been, of course, leading the efforts to assist those people returning home. What they are doing is providing them with emergency assistance. When these people are returning home, they're providing them with some cash assistance and other form of assistance, such as non-food items, identifying people who are particularly at risk, such as vulnerable women, unaccompanied minors, etc., and trying to do some follow-up with them. But this is taking up the major part of UNHCR's budget in Afghanistan. What needs to be done is also ensuring that reintegration activities are set up to make sure that returns are sustainable. It is not enough to give people money to survive for a few months. We need to ensure that they can survive in the long run, that they have access to shelter, that they have some piece of land, that they have that they have water, that they have access to markets and livelihoods. And these reintegration activities have largely been missing because this population has not been a priority for the international community. This is one of the things Refugees International is really strongly advocating for. We are talking about 20% of Afghanistan's population. These people need focused programs to make sure that they are able to survive in the places they have relocated to.
It's interesting. One of the points you make in the paper is that the situation in Afghanistan, unlike I think probably situations elsewhere in the world, is not under-resourced. There is sort of a lot of money being directed toward Afghanistan, but the problem is, I guess, is that it's not, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's not sort of directed in a way that sort of makes for these durable solutions for the refugee crisis.
Exactly, and not only for those durable solutions, but also to address other humanitarian situations and needs. I think there needs to be a reprioritization of assistance in Afghanistan. It's a country that is relatively lucky in that most appeals are funded, most donors are interested because they have, in general, political motivations, but also a military presence in the region. That's something we should take advantage of and ensure that they are investing in all issues, not only development and reconstruction, but also addressing humanitarian crisis, addressing needs of returnees and refugees in the region. What we would like to see is aid being redistributed according to those needs. We would like to see those large development projects being focused in high return areas so that they can benefit not only returnees but also their host communities who have to bear the burden of having people coming back and sharing resources with them. So we really do hope that in November, when the UN Refugee Agency launches together with the Afghan government a reintegration conference in Kabul to discuss those very issues, we really do hope that international donors will realize how important it is to invest in those issues and to ensure that returns are sustainable, that communities are supported, and that development programs benefit everybody, especially the most vulnerable.
And again, you're talking about sort of 20% of the population probably falls, under this category of sort of returning refugee or displaced.
Exactly.
How much of sort of aid work in Afghanistan is done by sort of the military, is done by NATO?
A lot of it, and that is, of course, one of the problems that have surfaced in Afghanistan, is the blurring of the line between civil and military actors. There is a principle in international law that basically aid should only be distributed by the military when it's a last resort, when nobody else can have access to those areas. Unfortunately, this principle is not respected in Afghanistan, and this has caused a blurring of the lines. Humanitarian actors need to remain impartial. They need to be able to talk to all actors in a conflict, and they need to be able to have access in any area, whichever group controls that area. And because of the blurring of the line, it has been extremely difficult for humanitarian actors to really be able to conduct and fulfill their mandates.
I guess, why is sort of NATO sort of taking the lead on a lot of these humanitarian issues and a lot of these sort of reconstruction issues? Is it a matter of funding, because that they just have sort of the resources at their disposal that sort of the humanitarian aid community does not?
Well, certainly it seems to be a worrying trend that governments tend to want their aid to go through their provincial reconstruction teams, through their armed forces, rather than through humanitarian groups that have been trained and know how to deliver in an impartial way and while respecting humanitarian standards. But in Afghanistan, there's a variety of provincial reconstruction teams, and some have been operating in a good way, some have not. Some have been cooperating with the international communities, others have not. So it's very difficult to really issue a blanket statement and say whether as a whole they have been doing a good or bad job. It really does depend on where they are. What we can say, however, is that, again, humanitarian aid should be distributed first and foremost by humanitarian actors, and despite the political motivations behind NATO member countries who want to see aid going to the areas their troops are, we need to see aid going to areas where needs are. We cannot decide where aid goes based on political motivations. It has to be a needs assessment, and aid has to go where the needs are.
And where does most of the aid dollars come from? Is there sort of a group of countries that contribute most?
Well, certainly, as we've mentioned, NATO member countries have been extremely active in providing assistance. Countries like the US, the UK, Germany, Canada have very large programs in Afghanistan. I believe in the situation of Canada, it's probably the largest aid program in the world for them. But again, we have seen in many cases that aid is directed politically insofar as they try to fund projects in the areas where the troops are as a way of winning hearts and minds. And this is the problem, again, because these are not necessarily the places where most of the needs are. We need to see those donors really look at Afghanistan and at the region as a whole and in a comprehensive manner, and tackling every issue with the same resolve as they do in security.
Now, it's funny, you mentioned Canada as being sort of an example of a country giving a lot of money there. It seems, though, that much of the Canadian population, I think a lot similar to the population of a lot of Western European countries, seems to be sort of slowly turning against the war in Afghanistan. I guess, do you see that? And if so, I mean, what do you see that sort of affecting future commitments? Because presumably there's going to be a lot more money is going to be needed in Afghanistan even after sort of troops pull out. Do you see sort of funding streams potentially jeopardized by sort of the sort of growing unpopularity of the Afghan war in these populations?
Well, it's certainly a major concern for ourselves, but for the aid community as a whole. Afghanistan is far from being out of the woods. There needs to still be a lot done before the international community can claim mission accomplished and leave, both in terms of security situation, but also in terms of the humanitarian and development situation. The government of Afghanistan is far from being able to handle the reconstruction and the humanitarian needs of the country. It is a very new government. Its capacity is still fairly weak. It needs a lot of support. It needs a lot of technical input before it can really take on those massive projects and those massive issues. We certainly do hope that the international community keeps its commitment intact and actually increase its commitment to Afghanistan, because promises were made. Afghan people are hopeful that the international community will deliver, but they are already a little disappointed by the lack of progress that has been made over the past 7 years. Many Afghans have not at all felt the effect of the billions of dollars that were invested in the country, and for Afghanistan to stabilize, for the whole region to stabilize, there needs to be better reaching out to the most vulnerable Afghans, and that is a job that is still that the international community has still really failed to achieve.
I guess what maybe we hear news reports that Afghanistan is sort of sliding a bit. The security situation is deteriorating. What, I guess, in your opinion, needs to be done politically to sort of regain the momentum in Afghanistan?
Well, I am, of course, a humanitarian advocate, not a political specialist. But what I can say is that the political situation has had a direct impact, of course, on the humanitarian situation. We have seen newly caused displacements because of conflict in the south, in the east of the country. We have seen an increase in civilian casualties caused by both anti-government insurgents, but also by the coalition forces. And certainly in terms of humanitarian access, humanitarian actors in Afghanistan have decreased access to the country, an access that has been decreasing consistently since 2005. And this is, of course, causing a lot of problems when it comes to assisting people who are most in need. So the humanitarian situation cannot be dissociated from the political one. They go hand in hand. And we certainly do hope that the international community and the U.S. government in particular pay attention to what's going on in Afghanistan, because the way it is affecting vulnerable Afghans cannot be underestimated.
And what I guess what about the poppy situation? To what I guess it seems that when I read reports about the situation in Afghanistan, it's the one of the main destabilizing issues is the sort of Afghan poppy production, which I read recently accounts for something like 90% of global opium output. Mm-hmm. Is there a way of distancing or disassociating of poppy production with sort of Taliban funding? Does that make sense? So it seems to me that much of the opium and then the poppy production is sort of fueling the insurgency. Is that your impression as well?
Well, that is certainly the impression that people in the country have. Again, has not been the focus of our study. What we can say, however, is that in general, people need alternatives to survive. And in general, the international community has failed to provide really strong livelihood projects and ways for ordinary Afghans to survive and to be able to feed their families. We have invested billions and billions of dollars in the construction of roads, of water tanks, of infrastructure, which was, of course, very well needed. But we have neglected to look at the human factor and at human needs. This is why the title of our report is Invest in People. What we would like to see is very targeted interventions to ensure that vulnerable people can survive, can learn skills, can have access to livelihood projects, can have access to local markets. With respect to poppy production, one of the things we need to look at is what alternative are we offering people, and can they survive without the cultivation of poppy? Whether this poppy goes directly to fund the insurgency, I do not know. What I do know, however, is a lot of farmers have no other choice because they have not been provided with any other alternative.
Well, Kristele, thank you so much. This was really informative. It's one of those subjects that pretty much you rarely see sort of talked about. So I'm glad we were able to bring it to light a bit. And I would encourage folks to read your report, and we'll have a link to it up on the site. Thank you very much. This was
Thank you
great.
very much for having me, Mark.